Okay, I'm waiting on the signal to make sure that we're live on the air, live on our Facebook and all of that.
We're good.
We're good. Okay. All right. Welcome to this Friday webinar from the Arkansas Public Policy, this series that goes on during the 2025 legislative session. So we have another priority today that we need to inform people about some upcoming legislation. And we have a guest that I'm going to allow to introduce himself first. But let me just give everybody a quick spiel about what's going on today. We got a very unique coalition here in the state of Arkansas, the Arkansas Coalition to End Juvenile Fines and Fees, or the Arkansas Coalition to End Youth Fines and Fees, rather. And our coalition is very unique because it combines a few things: research, communications, public engagement, advocacy, grassroots organizing, to make sure that we have some support for this legislation to abolish juvenile fines and fees. Now, people know that Arkansas Public Policy Panel and Arkansas Citizens First Congress is a part of this coalition, but we also have some partners, NAACP State Conference in Arkansas, Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, Arkansas Justice Reform Coalition, the WSG Group, as well as our guest today, Disability Rights Arkansas. So I want to introduce Thomas Nichols today to talk about the work of the Youth Fines and Fees campaign. This national campaign is about debt-free justice, but also to talk more in depth about the work of Disability Rights Arkansas involvement with this coalition and this campaign, and just learn more about how we can advocate and get ready for this legislation that should be filed soon. So Thomas Nichols, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Osiris.
Yeah, thank you for agreeing to be a part of this webinar series. I just want to start off with just an introduction of about the work of Disability Rights Arkansas, and also you personally, just an introduction from yourself about who you are.
Sure. So my name is Thomas Nichols. I'm a lawyer. I've been practicing law since 2009. And since 2015, I've been with the nonprofit organization Disability Rights Arkansas. Right now, I'm the director of the legal and advocacy services that we do. So all of our work related to investigations, individual representation, and advocacy. All of what we call our program staff is either supervised by me or through other managers. So Disability Rights, like I said, is a nonprofit organization. We've been around since the 1970s. We came about as a result of abuse and neglect that occurred at a large intermediate care facility for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in upstate New York. Um, Once that was brought to light, Congress created federal funds and allocated federal grants to independent nonprofit organizations such as ours. There is one of us in every state and territory, 57 total in the United States. And we are a part of that network of what's called protection and advocacy systems. We receive about 9 federal grants for different types of disabilities and in different subject areas. And we do all sorts of activities ranging from some policy work, like what we're here to talk about today, to investigating abuse, neglect, and exploitation, to individual representation in some high impact areas like special education, guardianship, Medicaid access, and vocational rehabilitation and other types of employment issues. So, like Osiris said, we're part of this coalition that brings together a lot of different experiences, a lot of different areas of the state, underserved areas, unserved areas, but also areas that exist in major population centers. We try to make sure that we have a mixed bag of all different viewpoints, all different perspectives, but all are impacted by the subject we're here to talk about today.
Thank
Our
you.
role with yeah, and I was just gonna say our role with the organization or with this coalition has been to connect the group with individuals who have been impacted by delinquency cases. A lot of what we do has a significant amount of crossover. And in addition, we do love gathering and analyzing data with some of our policy work and in other areas. And so we assisted the coalition with gathering that data and analyzing that data to try to help further this ultimate goal.
All right, thank you, thank you. And so I just want to start off the conversation because I think a lot of people are unaware of what the fees and the costs that are associated with juvenile fines and fees are and how families are impacted. So can you, for those who just may be unaware of this issue, can you just tell me about what these costs can include, what these court fees look like to just the average person and the family that's dealing with those issues?
Sure. So, like I said, a lot of the work that we do is around special education work, but also Medicaid access, right? And Medicaid is primarily for low income families, families who are already struggling to make ends meet, usually with either disabled parents or youth with disabilities, but in any circumstance, limited income, unless there's some of the few who are in some Medicaid buy-in programs. So we represent a lot of people who are below that poverty line and are struggling to make ends meet. So while we don't represent people, children in delinquency cases, the significance of this crossover is huge. And so when a child who is typical of a child that we would represent in a special education issue, for example, that child has probably already been subjected to a circumstance where they might have to be at home many hours of the day, uh, already impairing a parent's ability to be able to work, depending on whether or not the child can be alone. So, in a state that already has wages that are depressed when compared to nationwide, when you look at the people who are ultimately exposed to this juvenile justice system, you're talking about the majority of those individuals are already below the poverty line, already struggling to make ends meet, already struggling to put food on the table. A lot of them are in scenarios where a parent's not unable to work, like the one that I brought up, largely because of some missing support that exists in some of the state's other areas that should be available, like Medicaid and like special education. So we know from some studies that the majority of the children who are exposed to the juvenile justice system are already below that poverty line. So even $10 here or $10 there might be the difference between paying a different bill or paying to put food on the table. And it's a nationwide trend, right? It's a nationwide issue. Arkansas is not an exception, but it unquestionably affects the children that we represent when they're in situations where a parent is perhaps a single parent already below the poverty line. So, uh, compounding that issue, you're talking about children who might be submitted to the juvenile justice system for something like terroristic threatening, for example. And it might be a student who has significant mental health needs that aren't otherwise being addressed. And compounding the difficulty that a family is already experiencing with the difficulties at school is now difficulties at home, being exposed to the justice system, creating strain among the family unit because an 8-year-old child is not going to be paying a fine. A 12-year-old child is not going to be paying a fine. It's going to be the family, and that strains what might already be a stressful situation. So a child who might have extreme anxiety or major depressive disorder, this is not going to help their situation if they're going to feel responsible for late fees on a bill that goes unpaid because they've incurred fines on behalf of their family, and it increases the stress overall.
Thank you, thank you. And so when we're talking about the different fines and the fees that the people who have been directly impacted by the system are dealing with, what are some of the methods that Disability Rights Arkansas has used to collect data on the youth fines and fees?
Sure. Yeah. So when we ran because we did try as a group, the group tried to get a similar bill passed a couple of years ago, right? And this isn't the first time that they've tried to uh, uh, seek some type of legislative fix for fees and fines. And the last time that they ran that bill, it was uh, opposed by the judiciary, largely, from what we can tell, largely because a lot of these fees and fines are going towards programs or goods or services that the judiciary uses to try to rehabilitate the youth. There are some after school programs, parent classes, things that might benefit a youth that is not primarily for a punitive reason. Some of these fees and fines were going to pay for those activities and those services. So we thought as a group, well, if we are as a state incentivizing placing these fees, if we're incentivizing fees and fines being in place in order to pay for these good programs, why is the state not funding them through a different mechanism than on the backs of families and youth?
Right.
So we needed to get a sense of how much money are we talking about? How much money is going to fund these programs in the first place? Because if we're talking about eliminating a source of revenue for the judiciary and it's going towards important services, we need to make sure that those services are funded. So we started a couple of years ago just doing a Freedom of Information Act request to the judiciary, which yielded a tiny amount of information. The most common response was, We don't have to comply with your request. You can get that from the administrative office of the courts. We don't have this data, or we're not going to give you this data." We did get some good data from a very small handful of the counties, but in large part, uh, the data was just not being tracked by the judges so far as we could tell.
Mhm.
So we, with the assistance of a legislator, no, a legislator requested that the Bureau of Legislative Research here in the state put together a survey to send out to the judges who handle juvenile cases to see if perhaps they could elicit a response of at least how much revenue this is bringing in, how often they're using juvenile fees and fines for what purposes and what amounts, how much are they actually recovering, and then also how much does it cost to collect these fees and fines, which we thought would be very important to understand, because if it's a source of revenue and you're spending money to bring in that revenue, uh, that's going to impact what that final number is of how much we're actually having to fund for these good programs. Well, that didn't yield much of a response either. We got about a quarter of the judges responded, and only about a handful of those were data that we could really use for much. But it did give us an idea, right? Let's go to the administrative office of the courts. They handle all of the courts' information systems. So a lot of what they do is kept electronically now. So if they have all of that data in a place where it's electronic, they've been kind enough to be able to give us access to that data in a format that we can see and that we can use. So through trial and error, multiple times, trial and error, we finally were able to zero in on some data that reflected a couple of things. First of all, none of it says how much money they've actually received. That's tracked through some other process that differs from county to county. That's part of the problem with the juvenile fees and fines in the first place, is that differs from county to county. There's no standard, you've committed this crime, you're going to be fined this amount. There's no standard, you have this fee that's for a service, you're going to have to pay this amount of fee. It just really depends on the jurisdiction in which you live. Some courts don't charge fees and fines at all for any purpose. Some forgive them for something, some don't. Some use a sliding scale based on income. Some might use a different sliding scale based on income. So you're seeing the problem then with how do we find out what is a good number, especially if we don't have access to how much they're actually bringing in. We don't necessarily have receipts for every fee and fine that was replaced. So what we could zero in on was how much was charged. How much was a fine or fee in the first place? A child commits an act of, we'll go back to terroristic threatening. Maybe they're fined $100, just for example, right? So there's a record of that for some of the courts that are keeping good data. And it's very few, as you can imagine, it's not very many courts that are keeping very faithful, reliable data so far as we could tell. So say it's $100 that you've charged as a fine. Well, we can also get the balance of fees and fines. So if that balance is zero, something had to happen to it. One of two things. Either it was paid or it was forgiven. Since we know that some courts forgive fees and fines, some courts require them to be paid. It's probably different based on every single case that comes in every single county. But we know here was a charge and here is a balance. If it's zero, then that means all of it's been paid. If it's a charge of $100 and $50 remains, that means that there's $50 that's uncollected and $50 of it was either paid or forgiven, right? Um, so we're able to see here's how much was charged and here's how much was either recovered or forgiven. So we thought that at least we can show how much is not being collected. So if we're instituting $10,000 worth of fines and we're either collecting or forgiving roughly half of that, then to make sure that we're not underfunding these programs, we decided to use that number, the number that reflects the amount that was either paid or forgiven, right? If it's all paid, then it's funding exactly what has been actually collected by the judiciary over the course of the last several years. If part of it's paid and part of it's forgiven, we'd rather it be overfunded than underfunded, right? I'm sure the judges would as well, right? And so that's where we decided to land on how this could be actually funded other than through the juveniles, is having the legislature allocate the amount that they've actually either recovered or forgiven. And we got that data from the administrative office of the courts, but again, like I said, all of the counties don't keep this faithful data. So we had another problem. right? If we don't have the data from all of the counties, how can we then extend this data that we have from a few of the counties to the rest of the state? So we have to make some assumptions in that. Nobody's going to get perfect data. Statisticians, when you have a problem of not everybody is keeping data, you have what statisticians call garbage in, garbage out, right? If you're not putting good data in, then you can't really get good data out without logically making some assumptions. So what we did is we did have good data from counties that represent about a third of the population of the state. And that's a third both of the people of the state. So if Pulaski County represents 10% of the state population, then that makes, if we have good data from Pulaski County, we've got 10% of the population of the state represented right there. We've got a good mix of counties that both use a lot of fees and fines, and counties that we know are trying to move away from fees and fines. And there's not just one county that does that. So it's a good representation of both of those types of counties. Some of the counties are very good at collecting fees and fines or otherwise forgiving, since we can't differentiate, and some have a lot more of an outstanding balance. So we're trying to make sure that we have a good mix of it. We have data for about a third of the counties. So we looked at those counties. What did they actually bring in or forgive? What is that number? Well, extrapolating those numbers for the entirety of the state, based on that one third of the population that we had data for, we found out that on average, total annual collections or forgiveness, because remember, it's both of these things, was about $137,000 a year, which in the grand scheme of things is not a huge number. Uh, but it's an incredibly large number for these families who are having to pay it. And if that's what it costs for those programs to be funded, we feel like it would be much better funded on an ongoing basis by the legislature than through these working families. So that's how we came to those conclusions.
Got you. So I appreciate that. And uh, just from listening to you, I think the listeners understand that there's a lot of barriers to collecting data here in the state of Arkansas when it comes to our juvenile courts. And there isn't, I'll just say 100% transparency on data being provided, because everybody kind of, like you mentioned, kind of has their own system, and some people just don't comply with the FOIA requests. You know, they tell you go look for it other ways. So uh, appreciate
And
that work. Go ahead.
and to what you say, I just being as fair as I could be, the judges didn't have to respond to our FOIA requests. So a lot of them did anyway, right? But the information that we sought, not necessarily subject to FOIA, and they are the decision makers ultimately of what is or isn't subject to FOIA. So they didn't have to provide that to us. Some were kind enough to do so. Some see it as a very important goal of ours to try to make sure that fees and fines are eliminated. Um, and the same goes with tracking the data itself. I think it's a wonderful idea if we track that kind of data, so that we can really see what is it costing. Is it costing more to collect it than we're actually bringing in which case, why are we doing it? We don't have great data on that, but we do know that some counties spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on collecting fines, which eats into what that revenue ultimately is that could go towards funding these good programs. But the judges aren't under a legal obligation to keep this data. They're not required to put it in. Some are very good about it. Some are not. But as far as having an obligation to put it in, nothing in the law requires them to keep this data the way that some circuits have done a very good job of doing it.
Thank you. I got another question for you. What legal or policy arguments do you feel like support the elimination of juvenile fines and fees for youth and people with disabilities?
Well, sure. In law school, we learned about kind of the theory of criminal law, and I think this holds true for juvenile law. Um, you could have a punitive form of criminal law, or you can have a rehabilitative form of criminal law. Um, in our country, we want it to be both. We want it to be punitive and we want it to be rehabilitative, but that doesn't hold true for youth. Arkansas, when it comes to delinquency cases, the reason that we can have this delinquency process is because it is rehabilitative in nature. And the imposition of fees and fines, the data bears out that it leads to a greater chance of recidivism, of repeat or reentry into the justice system. Um, these families already have it so difficult in life, just in trying to make ends meet, especially when you consider that most of them who are exposed to the judicial system, the juvenile justice system, are below that poverty line. A lot of our at-risk populations are overrepresented in the justice system as a whole, but definitely the juvenile justice system. Think of children who have significant mental health needs or developmental disabilities. They are overrepresented when compared with the population as a whole. So that makes it all the more important for us to have a rehabilitative form of the juvenile justice system instead of it being a punitive system. And fees and fines are a punitive response, more so than a rehabilitative method of juvenile justice.
Yeah, definitely. And like you mentioned, this is really it's a punitive consequence, but it's impacting the parents, the guardians, the caretakers more than anything. When you talk about making people financially responsible uh, and having to deal with these hardships, just out of curiosity, do you know of or do you feel that this could be a case study where data collection can lead to changes in the juvenile legal system?
Yeah, I think it could be for a couple of things. If ultimately this bill passed, it would be in large part towards or because of the fact that the legislature recognizes that these things that the juveniles and their families are paying for are are necessary and should be funded through some other mechanism than the youth themselves and their families. But also, it might reflect more than anything the importance of keeping this kind of data to be able to show what is the actual effect of this on families. We can gather anecdotal data, individual experiences, which are extremely powerful. When you hear about a family who has gone through these difficult circumstances, and many others then who are in some type of alternative system other than fees and fines, like a community service type response that might be rehabilitative in nature. And you see that, and you see how what a profoundly positive impact that can have on a youth. Um, Maintaining the data is important to show whether it's necessary, why it's necessary, and reflects whether it should continue or needs to be changed or reformed. I mean, data can drive a lot of positive change, but it has to be good data.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And so, in your opinion, what strategies would you suggest advocacy groups and our community leaders use to educate the lawmakers, the legislators, and just the general public about eliminating juvenile fines and fees?
Well, nothing will move them quite as much as hearing individual stories.
Mhm.
And yeah, we at our organization, we could talk a lot, but we need people who have the lived experience of how this has impacted their lives to call their local legislator, the person who is going to the Capitol to represent them, and tell them about how juvenile fees and fines have impacted their lives or impacted a family member's life, and the difficulties that they have experienced. But also, equally as important, how much an alternative has been a positive experience when fees and fines might have been forgiven for some reason, or perhaps there was a diversion opportunity, parental accountability classes, community service, all of these alternatives that are in place that were more meaningful to rehabilitation of a juvenile, and more beneficial in the long term than having to pay when paying is hard.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there isn't, like you mentioned, there isn't a replacement for the the lived experiences and sharing those stories with people who may not have a clue how fines and fees really have an impact on families. Um, the the things that happen once they've been implemented and how that's like a domino effect on other things that could happen in the household that you know we don't get the opportunity to hear unless somebody does share their stories. Um, uh, One of my final, we got a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Um, were you able to collect any data about what fines and fees had an impact on families during, I'll say, the height of the pandemic when during the COVID-19 health crisis?
Well, reliably, based on just the data that we have, which doesn't personalize this as much as the anecdotal experiences would, but reliably across the counties during COVID, we saw that the number of fees and fines was lower, and the collection was lower. We don't know, except perhaps when schools were closed down, perhaps they weren't being referred to law enforcement as often. Um, Perhaps the judiciary wasn't taking or charging as many juveniles with delinquency. Or perhaps if there wasn't a decrease in the number of cases, perhaps they just weren't uh, initiating fees and fines like they were before. You know, there were a lot of programs that were in place to kind of halt the imposition of things like evictions, and fees and fines might have been no different. But then again, you're talking about each individual county, each individual judge would have had their own way of doing things. But across the board, we saw that those numbers went down during COVID. But reliably the same things were the largest amounts of fees, things like a public defender fee, things like monitoring fees and DNA fees and all of those types of things. The percentage of what were the most fees and fines didn't change from one year to the next.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important information to know that even during a crisis, like that, fees generally remain the way they are. Um, and people need to understand those type of fees that are occurring. The expenses for incarceration into detention centers, public defenders, electronic monitoring, um, medicine, transportation. All of those things are need to be taken into account. Um, my last question for you before we kind of close things out. Um, just from the data that you collect, did you hear about any good alternatives to fines and fees that really had a good impact on people and turn things into a positive situation for any families or any people in the community?
Gosh, I can't recollect exactly which judge it was or even which part of the state it was, but there was one judge who has completely eliminated fees and fines in her community, and has replaced it totally with access to youth programs and
Mhm.
enrolling youth in just those type of rehabilitative programs that we were talking about earlier, whether it's community service, whether it's a big brother, big sister program, any of those types of programs where justice impacted youth can be diverted away from the system and placed in a positive environment to help develop uh, better life skills, increase decision making. All of those are going to be great alternatives. It's just scraping together where those services exist and making sure that those services can continue to be funded for these youth.
All right, thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned that, and that's great for that county. I think this bill will definitely make people think a little bit more about ways that we can implement prevention and intervention programs, youth engagement and youth empowerment programs here in Arkansas, and start thinking about some ways that we can do more things to have I'll say corrective actions instead of punishment for our youth and our families. It's been a good conversation. Learned a lot about data collection and why this is so important to the Arkansas Coalition to End Youth Fines and Fees. How can the people listening and replaying this webinar follow the work that Disability Rights Arkansas is doing here in the state? The good work.
Sure. Well, we have Facebook. If you just Google Disability Rights Arkansas, you'll be able to find us anywhere. If you're in a different state, a lot of them have very similar names: Disability Rights Texas, Disability Rights Oklahoma, right? But we're here in our state, so we have Facebook. We have I'm sure we have some type of Instagram. We have a website. We put out news releases on our website. Also, Facebook, uh, Twitter, or I guess X now. Yeah. So all social media, look for us. We also have lots of webinars on YouTube at Disability Rights Arkansas.
All right. Well, thank you. I hope this was an informative conversation for the people viewing and the people that will replay this later on about how, the criminal legal system debt has an impact on youth, could have longer impacts on youth and the families that are put into debt by the criminal legal system, and how we can work on some alternative ways to collect data, to do the research and create a better Arkansas for all of us in general. Thank you for watching this Friday webinar. Thanks again to Thomas Nichols from Disability Rights Arkansas. Everybody, make sure you follow the page, the social media pages, the platforms, visit the website, learn more about the organization, and also check out Arkansas Citizens First Congress online as well on the social media platforms. Learn more about the CFC priorities, and make sure Monday, 8:30, 8:45, there is a lobby day that we're inviting all the groups to come out and to be a part of to learn more about the CFC priorities. One of them is definitely eliminate youth fines and fees, but you can learn more about the priorities of CFC, Citizens First Congress, and join us on the lobby day to talk to legislators, and hopefully we can talk to a few legislators in the committees about eliminating youth fines and fees. Until next time, peace. Have a great weekend.